Hi there, my name's Dave with the Lending Voices podcasting project, the South Lanarkshire Libraries, and today I'm here with Sreevas, who is a Professor of Business and Entrepreneurship at the University of Glasgow, and he's also the co-creator of the Clyde Samvada Podcast via the Hindu Temple of Scotland, which the Lending Voices project is very proud to help support there. So today we're going to talk about your work and your thoughts on technology, culture and community, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Really, the first question is, can you tell us a little more about yourself and what you do?
First, thank you so much, Dave. Thank you so much for the Lending Voices team for having me on your podcast, and also for all the support that you have offered us for the Clyde Samvada podcast as well. I am Sreevas, a Professor of Business and Entrepreneurship at the Adam Smith Business School in the University of Glasgow. I've been in Scotland for about 7 years now. I am originally from India. I was born in the state of Tamil Nadu, which is in the southern part of India, but I was brought up all the while in the state of Kerala, again in the south of India. Did all my undergrad, PhD, all of that in India. Came over to the UK about 7 years ago. I was briefly at the University of Strathclyde, and now I am at the University of Glasgow, where I am a professor. I teach entrepreneurship, international business, innovation, aspects like that.
Fantastic. One of the things that I've thoroughly enjoyed on the occasions that I have helped to support the podcast via filming and with the audio equipment is the opportunity to sit in on and just soak up conversations that normally I wouldn't be able to. And I found it very, very interesting. One of the topics that interests me a lot is the correlation between Hindu wisdom and modern science. I've got a passing interest in a lot of different religions and sort of belief systems, but I've never come across one which so closely aligns with modern scientific discovery before. And is that something that you find yourself that you...
Absolutely. I think right from elements like certain sounds being more appropriate for certain stimulations in the brain, right? So one of the key aspects that we have as part of how we do rituals in the temple is a lot of chanting, which is mantras is what we are chanting in that. And they have like different decibel levels to them. So there are certain parts of it where you go as in like the higher note, and certain levels where you're like in the stable note, and then certain areas where you go in the down note. And they are so well designed that it invokes certain stimulations in the brain in terms of, let's say, calming the nerve or sort of rising the nerve or rising the heat levels in the body, or some others which are like calming the body down, all of those things. So when you think about yoga and meditation and all of it, oftentimes it's just about the physical element attached to it, or sometimes it is just about breathing in and out. But sometimes it also has a sound element attached to what is being done. And that happens, or that's designed in such a way that there are these elements attached to it. So I think there's a lot of research potential from a neuroscience angle to understand a lot of this and get at depth. There's some research has already happened, but very, very fascinating in terms of how this might play out in modern world and modern times.
The part that really was astounding to me was things like cosmic ages. Having a concept of the idea of just how old the universe might be was reflected in what I could learn about Hinduism. Statements and ideas and concepts about matter, which has taken the Western world a very long time to get to grips with. I found reflected in that material. It was very fascinating.
Absolutely, and in fact, like there's this the way Hindu thought or Eastern philosophy at large sort of looks at some of these things is, it's not a linear evolution story, right? Like, I'm not being a critique here. I'm just kind of thinking about how the philosophies approach some of these things, right? So the Western philosophy thought oftentimes is like the current day is sometimes sort of conceived as the highest point of where the humanity has reached. So that's a very linear thought into the civilizational growth of human race.
Yeah.
While the Eastern philosophy doesn't have that sort of a connotation to it. It's more cyclical. Yeah. So it's like at different points of history, certain civilizations were at the high. At that time, they might have actually known a lot more than what we might know today. And then there's also the cyclical element with regard to life itself, to the extent of there's this afterlife and there is this rebirth, you kind of carry karma over. All of those small concepts, right? So the cyclical element is very core to how Eastern philosophy views things, and it's quite different from how Western philosophies.
I've heard referred to in Western philosophy as the myth of progress.
Yeah.
The idea that you're absolutely right, that we are the pinnacle.
Yeah.
I think it can be quite a destructive mindset, this idea that we are currently the very best that's ever been. So it could be potentially a bit more of a holistic and healthy way to approach. Maybe we'd have a bit more respect for things if we looked at with that long view. So obviously, speaking about progress, one of the areas that you study is AI. So one of the questions I've got is, how are AI and the metaverse changing religious practices and cultural traditions today?
It's a very interesting. I'll tell you how I got around to this intersection in the first, because it was not a very consciously planned decision of me merging both worlds. I mean, the world of faith and religion has been a part of me right from childhood. Worship happens at home, at temples, so being a part of that from childhood. But it was totally a personal track. There was nothing professional intersection for that track. And in my day job at the university, I teach courses around how emerging technologies have implications on the future businesses, future business models, and how do you think about future consumer trends and think about designing business models with that view in mind and stuff. So this is a course that I've been running for a couple of years, 3-4 years now. And late last year, the Data Lab, which is the Scottish AI initiative, they had a podcast with Paolo Benatti. Paolo Benatti is the Pope's AI advisor.
Oh, wow.
And so they did this podcast as part of their annual tech event. And for that podcast, they wanted a couple of minutes of soundbite from other religious perspectives. And they reached out to the temple, and the temple knew that I do, like in my day job, this emerging tech type stuff. So the question came to me, and the question was, how do you think the future of AI would influence Hindu faith 100 years into the future? So that was not a question that I had expected or even thought about until it kind of came to me in that format. I gave a 2-minute soundbite, but somehow the question just stuck with me. Because it's like, if AI is doing what it is doing, what does it really mean for humanity, life, all of it? So earlier this year, I sort of penned down sort of a slightly longer piece around it, put it out as a blog in The Conversation, which kind of carries pieces from academics for generalist audience. That piece coincidentally had more readership than all my research in the last 10, 12 years.
People are thinking about this seriously for the first time.
So because it did what it did, suddenly I was being sort of pulled into conversations around AI and faith, and entrepreneurs who are working at the intersection of this, reaching out to know more about it. And I was like, I don't know AI that well. I don't know faith that well, because I'm not a theology or I've not studied religion in that depth. But I know bits and pieces of both, which is how I kind of tied this together. And the argument that I put forward in a couple of pieces around this is from a Hindu faith perspective, right? So one is, within the Hindu philosophy, there is something called Purushartha, which is 4 aims of life. That's Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Dharma is about righteousness. Artha is wealth and prosperity. Kama is pleasure. And Moksha is self-actualization or realization. So a life is meant for these 4, is how a Hindu sort of philosophy looks at it. And my argument at the intersection of AI was, if AI is going to be like a co-creator for us, which is where it's really heading, right? Then we need, if the dharma aspect, which is righteousness and morality and all of it, has to stay within the boundaries, then what gets trained on the AI needs to have those elements as well.
Absolutely.
Which is like righteousness, morality, ethics, all of it, right? So there's the whole discussion around AI and ethics. And my argument was, this is sort of for the dharmic future of humanity, we need that to be well in place. That's on the dharma side. Then I said, like, if AI is going to automate all of this, and if robots are coming to help do things, then it means that the amount of human effort that might be needed for economic activity will get reduced.
Yeah.
And my argument there is that is not necessarily a bad thing in itself. It's just that we need other models of how the economic balance gets maintained. And which means that money acquisition might not be the sole purpose of why we go out and do work. It frees up time for us as humans to explore other things.
More creative
industries and all of it.
Yeah.
So that's my argument on Artha. And the side argument to that is we might need some form of universal basic income type approaches where the state pitches in to augment for what would have been otherwise time spent on economic activity being augmented by some form of universal basic income coming in. So that's my argument on Artha. And then when time gets freed up, one, people will engage in more creative activities. Other, they might engage in more pleasure activities. All of this is not necessarily bad. So that's about the karma component, which is pleasure and enjoyment and all of it. Over a period of time, people will then realize that, yes, I have done all of these things. I would then start to question, like, what's my long-term purpose in life, and then where do you see myself in the long run when I'm old and all of it. And then the element about I need to maybe start doing meditation or understanding what's going inside me, introspection, all of it. And that will nudge people towards the path of moksha or self-realization, which largely is through meditation and all of those practices. So that was my argument, where you get time freed up over a period of time, and then over a period of time you will kind of engage more in moksha-related activities.
I really personally like this particular vision of the future with AI. It's very optimistic, but it's also, if we do things correctly, even removing the Hinduism and the complex, that there's no way to go wrong with that direction.
Absolutely.
And I think it's fascinating. We really have got ourselves into a position where work, labour, is such a massive part of most people's lives.
Absolutely.
And it's not always particularly fulfilling for large percentages of the population.
Right.
The idea that automation was coming to take away jobs is seen mostly as a negative because of the current financial and economic system. If there were a way to redesign things and to shift, it may not necessarily be as bad as you say. Though I was surprised to find out that in my lifetime, the focus of who is going to be displaced from the workforce has changed, and AI is responsible. Originally, machines will take the place of the working class worker. And that's been parked a little bit just now for this idea that these LLMs, these large language models, are capable of being trained very specifically. And, for example, lawyers.
It's the lawyers, the IT folk, all of them are where it's...
You're paying them for their expertise, but also to be an interface between you and the law system. And that is something which, with a very bulletproof AI system, could mean that's no longer a job. Now, being someone who isn't particularly wealthy myself, the idea of having cheap access to good legal advice is something that gives me hope. But I'd imagine if you're a lawyer, you might be sitting with a little bit of nerves as well. No, that was fascinating. Thank you. This is just a question that is an offshoot from the original, which was, how do you believe that technology, and emergent technologies, the world we find ourselves in just now, how do you think it can help preserve cultural heritages and traditions? We have this idea that as we blunder forward into the future, the past is left behind. But I don't like that idea. I want things to be preserved. We're in the library. We love to preserve an archive. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think there is both a role for AI in that and more so of metaverse in that. Let me give you an example to illustrate this, right? So there's a startup in India, for example, which is called Who We Are. And what they do is they create virtual immersive experiences of heritage spaces.
Oh, yeah.
What this is doing is, one, for people who might not be able to access, as in go to that place and visualize it or view it and enjoy it, you can sit at home, literally on your couch, have a screen, currently it's available both in tablet form as well as in the VR headset form. But eventually I think we will have we don't even have that, we don't have to have the Vision Pro type devices. Your glass would become your screen in some way
of
too.
Course, yeah.
And so on your screen, you can just press a button and you're seeing that heritage space coming live. So that's access. The other part is there are a lot of these heritage spaces which have become destroyed. As in either through invasion or there is dispute or whatever. It's now possible to recreate that also. And that's a bigger deal because we are now able to relive a time when we don't know how life itself was.
Reconstructions from the arcade.
Yeah, so I'll give you a very specific example.
Yeah.
So there is a place called Sharatapid, which is now in what is called as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. This is one of the ancient spaces of learning. That is one of the places which over invasion period kind of got fully demolished. So, but there are scriptural writings about this place in old texts. So what this startup has done is like pull those references up. They worked with a person who knows to draw places out of these scriptural references, got him to draw it.
Like a kind of concept art.
Like concept architecture of both the place as well as the idols in it or other, like what was there in the pillars and what sort of scriptural or drawings were there in the pillars, all of those specific details, whatever they got from like different texts which were there of that, they have made that. So it's a 2D structure. Then what they did is like went and talked to people who are into like building temples and architecture and all of it with the reference notes from the scriptural stuff. And it had like information like it has to be, in that day, it was made out of a specific type of willow, certain parts of the temple and all of it. And then they said, okay, to convert the 2D image which the person draw into a 3D visualization, we need to be very, very specific in terms of what sort of wood is the color of the wood, which gets...
They got that granular with
that granular level of detail. And now they have a full visualization of that old ancient site of learning, fully visualized. So something which people, even though they want to go it, they cannot still do it, is now being possible to relive and recreate and all of it. That I think is like super powerful to take the history along with us, as you rightly said, because one, history repeats itself, but then that's one side of it. But then the whole cultural narrative around it, the civilizational value attached to it, all of this gets preserved if we have these sorts of opportunities. So that I think is like extremely powerful as we see.
And it fits so perfectly in with the purpose of a public library. The idea originally being that the working classes could not afford a book. You know, and this idea of providing access to anything, to any type of resource that could help them further themselves in their life, you know, that is great. I've seen a few examples of this done. I used a VR headset that we have in the library service, and I found myself in an ancient temple in India, surrounded by monkeys. And obviously a person had been there with with I think maybe the 360-degree cam, and just sat for a while and allowed. I mean, I doubt I'll be able to get over to India anytime soon, and that it really does. Is a very special feeling. Not as obviously probably great as being there personally, but compared to not being able to at all, it was great. So, talking about hopeful uses of technology, one sort of current theme that I find very interesting that ties into podcasting is that we are currently in a situation where traditional media forms are leaving people feeling dissatisfied. The endless push for the 24-hour news cycle, the advertising, the kind of race to the bottom with the clickbait and the very angry or emotive subject matter, feels like it's pushing people ever further apart. And we hear so much about the dangers of oversubscription to technology.
Yeah.
All these things are absolutely valid concerns and interesting topics as well. But I like to focus more on the positive impact that this particular type of content may have. Podcasting, this longer form conversations, dialogues, and many other formats they can take, and how they can give people access to something that's a little bit better for their mental health or helps them discover new things. So with that in mind, thank you for bearing with me, it was a long setup. How do you think that the Hindu Temples podcast, Clyde Samvada, can help to promote openness and help bridge cultural divides in our society?
Really, really pertinent question. So how that podcast got started is at the temple, which is in Rutherglen, which is also where we are currently in. We had so there is no it's a fully volunteer run temple.
Yes.
And on Sundays when we have the regular service at the temple, at the start of it, we were just doing some form of interaction, especially with the younger generation that's growing up in Scotland, around certain tidbits, let's say around Indian cultural heritage, all of it. And somewhere in those conversations, we had a request saying we cannot come every Sunday sometimes, but then what you are saying is interesting. Why? So how can we access it if we don't come? So we said okay, let's just put it on video. And that's how the concept of Clyde Samvada as a podcast series started. And now we are sort of close to 50 episodes now. And the purpose there was multifold. Though the intention to start was how can we talk about cultural heritage bits for the younger generation, we realized that there is a lot of value, especially because this is being done in a diaspora foreign setting, for the local community within Scotland to also learn or sort of get to know the religion of Hinduism a bit better, Indian cultural heritage a bit better, all of it. So that's the motivation behind that. And what that has done is, now we have had, from a viewership standpoint, if I look at where the views come in from, there's been a lot of views which have come in from within Scotland, especially on our Instagram reels. We have had people who are from the local community in Scotland viewing it and sort of liking it and giving feedback to it. So I think there's a great value in how we can more seamlessly understand different parts of the world. And that is very, very important in current scenario.
I think so.
For unity and diversity and harmony and all of it.
That idea that ignorance or fear or division can only really grow in the darkness. So if we shed some light on each other and how we live our lives and our thoughts and our ideas, we can only really grow closer. So I find it a very hopeful and positive use of the technology. So thanks very much. And kind of moving on, something I find very interesting is that you're just recently back from a trip to the Himalayas.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about why you were there and what you discovered when you were out there?
So as part of my day job, so we've talked about other parts of this thing. So going back to my day job, I'm a professor at the business school, right? And one of the focus areas of my research is around entrepreneurship in rural communities and remote communities.
Oh.
So I have a funded research project that is looking at how ecosystems get built in such locations. And it was as part of that project that I was in Ladakh, which is part of the Himalayan region, where I was studying a particular startup called the Global Himalayan Expedition. What they do is they call people as adventure tourists. So that they take adventure tourists on an impact expedition, which essentially involves the tourist setting up some form of solar/sustainable energy based infrastructure in these remote communities.
Oh, right.
In the initial years, it was more like solar electrification. Subsequently, it was solar water heaters. In the expedition that I was a part of, like a month or so back, was around installing rocket stoves. They are a form of more efficient cook stoves with less carbon emission and better heat efficiency.
Right.
So this is colder parts of the world, right? So we went in summer, which was okay, but winters of 6 to 8 months can be extremely harsh with us.
Yeah.
And Scotland knows that better than other parts of the world, but because of the heating system we have, we probably are better off. But then in these regions, it was not that good. So it was a community where there were 16 households, quite remote. Until about 2-3 years ago, there was no road access to the place. So you had to trek until 3 years ago to reach the place even. You had to trek from like it's not just like on the floor, it's like trek through the hills.
Hard trek.
Thankfully, about 3-4 years ago, they've now got road access, which has improved access to multiple things. So they now have a school that's coming up. The health facility, earlier they had to carry people on like 2 poles.
Like a stretcher type?
Like a stretcher, like 2, so not even structure. I mean, so how they carried. So when we were there, one anecdote was very, very powerful personally. Was like, this was COVID times. And a lady, slightly older lady in the community got sick. So 4 younger men, 2 poles, essentially 2 wooden poles and like a sagging cloth in between.
Yes.
Kept the lady on that because the stretcher and the hospital infrastructure wouldn't reach.
Of course, yeah.
Carried her on that all the way to the hospital, sort of few kilometers off. And she was just in time, but then was a bit too late. And then, like, when she reached the hospital, she was okay, but then soon she passed away. I mean, so instances like this really hit hard when you kind of, and personally for me, when you hear these stories, you feel like how much more privileged you have been, even within the Indian setting where I grew up and in a Scottish setting where we are. So these are the realities of places like this. And we were looking at how do you build entrepreneurship in communities of that nature, where with ventures like this, the one that I studied, when they are taking these tourists in, there is a lot of economic activity that gets happened in this place because of that. I mean, things like food, things like whatever else is needed as part of it. And then there's also the part of each of these households getting a hard physical infrastructure which helps improve their lives. Last year, they were given these water heaters. This year, it is cook stove. What that is helping do is there's now possibility of them doing, let's say, homestays or doing some other productive uses of energy attached to it, like improve agriculture value chain. So, for example, in these regions, they grow barley, which is a form of grain. Then they have different forms of lychee, which is again a fruit. So there are possibilities of us now creating value-added products out of these agricultural based produce that will help improve livelihoods in those regions, right? So I hadn't realized to this extent the importance of road access until I heard some of the stories which are happening here, like how access to roads is one of the biggest economic drivers. Was quite a hard-hitting story for me from this particular visit. And we are now looking at what else we could do in terms of livelihood creation. How do you create subsistence, local nano-type entrepreneurship in these regions? So I've been doing this in multiple other regions as well, with indigenous communities, all of it. So there's this lot of insights that we get when we actually do these field visits to understand, one, realities of life, two, how can we be co-creators with these communities to improve livelihoods and job creation?
We've spoken about this previously outside of a podcast. And years ago, I read a book which was very eye-opening for me. Culturally in the UK, we have a tradition of charity drives, of campaigns via the television and where they'll show footage of a community in distress and there'll be a number to call to donate money. And traditionally, the British public have done a fairly decent job of driving up large amounts of financial donations or clothing and things like this. And the initial assumption is that this is a good thing. And I was very shocked and then interested to find out that that may not necessarily be the case. And we spoke about this at length, and about what does it do to an ecosystem and a community who may be struggling in some way, shape or form, but when you just have this outpouring of a resource in particular, with no thought put into what impact that may have, how will it disrupt that ecosystem. So people's caring or charitable impulse is a good thing, but how can we make sure that it is applied in a thoughtful manner that helps that community grow and be sustainable?
Let me give you two stories here.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
First story comes from the state of Kerala itself. During my undergrad days, I was doing engineering, and I was involved in a project on rural electrification. So went to a rural village, set up solar panels, all of it. This was a student-led project funded by foundation type money. So essentially charitable donation was the funding source. When the lights came on, lot of fancy glory, student group lighting up a village, PR around it, all fancy stuff, glory days. But the learning for me came an year and a half later, when the lights went off. And the lights went off because there was no proper maintenance happening, or what we hadn't conceived how the access to energy would help bring in other productive uses attached to it, let's say some form of livelihood creation or employment around it. We hadn't thought those bits. We were thinking like technical project, engineering resource, wiring, panel, connecting, bulb, end of story.
You were in problem solving mode.
But year and a half later is when I thought I learned more than what I learned putting it up. So that learning essentially was the driver for me to actually go into doing a PhD itself in the first place, where I began to focus on how do you build social entrepreneurship, business models with a social purpose, but sustaining over long periods of time. That's an example of a story of charity is good. I'm not saying charity is bad. It's just, if it's conceived this way, then it doesn't actually serve its purpose. It might serve the purpose of the first step, but it doesn't serve the purpose in the longer run. Now let me give you a second story. In Varanasi, which is known for the temple of Kashi Vishwanath, quite popular even globally because even celebrities go to this temple for its history and all of it. But that's one side of the temple and the place. But the bigger side, or the corresponding side also is there's a lot of begging that is happening on the ghats of this temple, ghats on the side of the temple. So ghats is like steps which are on, there are multiple of these ghats where every day in the evening something called the Ganga Aarati happens, which is like worship that's done to River Ganga. It's quite televised, it's quite popular globally, quite a spectacle in terms of how they put the whole thing up. In those ghats, a lot of begging happens. And to give you an example of how charity might be conceived differently is an example of a venture that is called Beggars Corporation. And what they do is they work with these beggars on the ghats and they are converting them into entrepreneurs. Beggars turned entrepreneurs. What they do there is that their motto itself is like, don't donate, but invest. So instead of what we do with begging in general is doling out like a pound or whatever. Again, good intention, we want to help, all of it. But it is doing two other things. One, it is making people dependent on others for everything almost. Two, there is a element of mafia, racket around it.
I can imagine it could spring up.
Or all sorts of negative forces around it. Both of which is not good, right? So once it becomes like a organized industry in itself, it's not an ideal setting where we want to be. So what this venture, for instance, is trying to do is, one, change mindset of the beggars, because they have over a long period of time assume that this is how their life will be. But for them to switch off that and then switch on the fact of, no, we can be our own revenue creators, we can be standing on our own leg, needs a mindset shift. So in the first few months of how they engage with these beggars, it's just working on building that mindset shift side of the story. And then they are working with them on, let's say, if they already have a particular skill, then building on that skill to look at economic opportunity around it. If not, training them on certain skills like tailoring, or because the temple is there, for services related to the temple, like helping, like a tour guide type support for maybe somebody to navigate through the temple, or even selling flowers for the use at the worship in the temple. Small things like that, which might not be like massive skill training level things, but then small things good enough to get them the confidence that they can stand on their own leg.
Yeah.
Once you have that, then the world is at your feet to explore. So that sort of a step change model is where they bring in money more as an investment route. It could be, we might think of this as donation. I mean, like, so for the people giving it, they might even conceive it as donation. So they have a model where they have returns attached to it as well. So it's like there are ventures set up by the beggars, where the beggars are also, let's say, part shareholders in the venture of, let's say, creating a tailoring unit or the flower one or different things. And then the money that's coming in is what is funding that initial mindset change. They have to be shifted from the streets where they are begging to a rental house. So you need money for that. So it's almost like whoever is sort of wanting to be involved in, they have like over a 2-year period, X amount of money is what you pay in. And that has this like first few months is all of these mindset change things, then a training phase, and then they get into starting something of their own. And then they have a payout schedule as well, which is like almost like a interest paying thing, but it's a very different way of conceiving it, right? So even for them, now they are shareholders in a company. The money might have come in part, the people putting in the money might have thought about it as charity, but the way it's getting deployed is not in a charitable mode. And that makes a lot of difference, because now you will have all these people think that I have to sustain, grow, run, all of those things, right? That puts people in a whole different mind space. And that's where we need it to happen, because then it will sustain over the long run. So charity adopted in these methods, which in some parlance it's called as venture philanthropy, where it kind of takes how a venture capital world would think about money deployment, but then see it from a philanthropic lens, where there is planning, there's an exit attached to it, there is due diligence attached to where the money gets deployed, all of these small things. And that's a very different, powerful model of how sustaining some of these ventures and sustaining some of these communities.
Just hearing about it, it does sound like it would be a much more empowering place to be. And it makes perfect sense. At the kind of outset, it's a much more considered approach.
Yeah.
And you're actually looking at data and how things work in these ecosystems and how to support them. Yeah. The example that I remember reading was about clothing. It was about this idea of we see images of people struggling and they don't look like they've got many clothes, and the impulse to, right, we've got plenty of spare stuff, send it over. And a small village may have 1 or 2 seamstresses who their entire livelihood is based on the creation or repair of clothing, and as well clothing suited to the climate.
Absolutely.
So shifting from send over our old clothes to send sewing machines is that thing where it's not initially the way that everything's worked here in regards to charity, but I think it's a really positive change. Absolutely. And hopefully will be a lot more sustainable. So thank you very much. One of the questions I've got is about libraries, kind of coming back around to libraries. How do you think that libraries can play a role in fostering cultural conversations and digital access?
I think going back to one of the previous examples, when you said like you had accessed a Hindu temple through a VR headset, I think one immense possibility is to, let's say, partner with some of these startups which are creating some of these content for, let's say, these virtual immersive deep experiences. The libraries already have VR headsets, and it's now then possible for libraries to do like a kiosk, which is, let's say, people can come in. It can even be a ticketed event, which then helps in some way support the library's resources as well to, let's say, immerse into different worlds.
Oh, yeah.
And that is extremely powerful, especially for the younger generation to access the larger, wider world, right? Yes, they are already probably doing a lot more than what we might have done in our younger days, given access to technology that they have. But having a more curated experience brings a lot more meaning to it. So when we have, let's say, a podcast conversation like this, which is part of which is used to curate an experience with a virtual reality headset,
all right,
and we augment that with something like an AI image generation style workshop, which I know you have a lot of skills in yourself, where you can then start to get the kids to think about futures with like a cultural heritage lens to it. Like how would a future city look like, which has elements of the heritage preserved while bringing in other elements of the newer world that's there, also preserving the nature within how the future city looks like. So visualization, future thinking are extremely powerful ways by which how we start conceiving what the world of the future will look like. And libraries could play an extremely powerful role there, building on from what these technologies can bring in. AI image creation, metaverse immersions, and then get the younger generation motivated, even for climate change, environment, heritage, whatever you say. So this is powerful ways of how all of these different things can be brought together, I feel.
I definitely want to explore it. We have a few VR headsets in the service ourselves, and they're really there more as development tools for ourselves to help us understand. We don't have enough yet for this type of experience, but if we spend some time, I think I'll make a note to do that, about how we could use them. I need to learn how to use them more myself. And then maybe future funding applications.
Absolutely.
That could be some direction we could go.
Absolutely.
And I'll thank you for it. If that happens, I'll let you know. I'll send you an email.
Sure.
Come check it out.
Happy to input.
So just before we kind of round up that, one last question, just focusing more again on the optimistic view, which isn't necessarily, I think, sometimes you hear the phrase optimism and it's almost looked at as, your naivety. I don't believe that's the case at all. But through that lens, is there any future trends in your work and research and technology at large that you're excited about?
One which is extremely interesting for me is what the digital public infrastructure space is beginning to do. Let me give you a story I do a lot of these stories. This is about a couple of years ago. I was in a place called Araku Valley. This is in the state of Andhra Pradesh. We were in a remote indigenous community location. Evening time, again, research work, going through some of these places. Evening time, stopped by on the roadside to get a cup of tea. When I say a tea shop, don't imagine a fancy Starbucks here. This tea shop is 4 poles of bamboo and a sort of sheet on top, asbestos sheet on top. And then tea being served out of a can, and there is sort of firewood burning under it, and that's how the tea will come. Got the tea, and the natural next step, being somebody who has gone through these places, is to go for my wallet to pay how much ever it cost. And she said it cost me 10 rupees, which is like 10 cents. Natural intention, went for my wallet. And then this lady in this remote rural location shows me a QR code. And I am like, this is not something which I expected to see. What has happened for this change to happen is the digital public infrastructure that has got built up. Showing this QR code tells you a number of backstories. One is the fact that this remote lady now trusts digital payments.
Oh, yeah.
Which means that she has to have had a bank account in the first place. If she had to have the bank account, she needs to have had some form of digital proof or identity of who she was. None of these is a given in these settings. We are not talking about a British setting where the moment you are born, you're given a birth certificate.
Yeah, yeah.
When these are all not a given, that is why you never had financial inclusion or all of this happening in these communities. With digital public infrastructure, which has got built up over the last 10 years, now there's digital identity, which was what was first built. Then a payment interface based on digital identity was built. This has meant that now this lady has a bank account. And then she trusts the bank account for the money to come in. And also trusts the bank that she can use the money when she wants it. So that is a space where I am seeing extremely strong optimism in terms of what it can do in global south and remote communities and all of it, because now they have identity, they are becoming formalized, they now have an audit trail, so now they can go to the bank and get a credit. Earlier, they will go to bank and say, the bank will say like, who are you?
Yeah,
I mean,
course,
like, how, like, do you have a house to give you a loan? No. Now they have, because the payments happen digitally, now you have a track record of what will happen on the month. And then, okay, this is what I earn in the month, you have now proof, now give me a loan. Opening up credit changes lives, especially in these sorts of communities. And that, I think, is an extremely powerful trend. It might not be hi-fi technology of an AI. So AI will come into it in terms of making it conversational AI. So language barriers gets broken down. So AI will start getting into this world, but then the whole world of this being built as a digital public infrastructure. It's not private goods. It's public infrastructure, digital commons-based platforms will I think make a very, very big difference. And that's a trend that I'm extremely optimistic about. And we're kind of studying how this plays out as well.
That's incredibly interesting. And again, I keep using the word hopeful, but it's another hopeful thing for myself. Over the course of my lifetime, I've obviously witnessed the birth of the internet and was an early adopter and loved it as a young teenager. And Web 1.0 came with a sort of optimism and energy and a sort of things are going to definitely change for the better type. You could feel it when you went on the forums. Everyone was very optimistic. And over time, as commercial interests and the private sector came in and commodified so many of those things, that feeling started to shift. But I'm realising now, hearing from yourself, that's a very UK Western-centric experience. Not everyone and everywhere clearly will be taking that same route. The idea of these resources as part of the commons, as part of a public infrastructure is, I wish we had that, more of that vision here, because it really, I can only imagine that you'll just see a massive uptick in the quality of people's lives as you've just sort of demonstrated. So yeah, thanks very much. That's given me a lot to think about. I suppose the last question really is, you've used Lending Voices. Do you have any advice for anyone who might want to start a podcast in South Lanarkshire? So
I think the nature of support that the Lending Voices team, particularly you, have provided us has been incredibly helpful, right? It kind of has elevated the quality of sound. Now I know more about like lighting and what sort of mics to use. So small things. Yes, I have read this up, but then until I had a sort of first-hand experience of using it, it helped me understand some of these things a lot better.
Oh.
And also the inputs that you gave, like off camera around tips into editing, tips into how I could use some of the AI tools to enhance some of the aspects. I think that those were extremely helpful as well. So for somebody who's just starting out, I think reaching out to your team just in terms of like a 101 on how to go around doing this would be really useful. That's one. And second, it is like podcasts like Lending Voices itself is now helping bring local community voices, right? So, I mean, partly YouTube is now the modern TV. And then given what you said about what happens in the news cycle and the rest of it, people want local voices to be heard. They're looking at other forms where they are consuming content from. And there, again, this comes in to be extremely handy as a mode of engaging with people, bringing their voices out, and then not just hearing all these sort of war-torn stories. I mean, yes, we need to know what news is, but then that shouldn't be just what we're consuming. So for our mental health and well-being, all of it, I think efforts like this are really powerful. So hope this continues on both in terms of Lending Voice podcast itself, as well as in terms of the infrastructure renting out facility that you have for much more longer years.
Well, thank you very much, Sreevas. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'm personally looking forward to seeing where Clyde Samvada continues to grow and getting to hear a lot more interesting conversations going forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you so much for having me at the Lending Voices podcast.
Thank you.